This is a video recapping my experience touring around Texas in the year of 2022. Now, I played 47 different gigs around Texas in this year, and these gigs were distributed across basically a triangle of areas. Going from Houston across to San Antonio, passing through Austin there and into the DFW area, basically forms a triangle. And there's a nice set of opportunities of places to play gigs all around these areas. So let's talk about that, talk about what I learned and so on. So it was January of 2022 when I ditched my couch, I threw away my bed, I threw away my rent, put my things in storage and put the rest of the stuff in the back of my truck, and I moved to Texas. Now I live a month at a time in the different areas of Texas, so I don't actually have a permanent home. And this was a point of stress for me when I initially came over. I was banking on the fact that I would be able to establish a residency and a license plate here, even though I don't have a physical address that has a property on it. And there's only 3 states where you could do that: Texas, South Dakota, and Florida. So I was able to do that, and everything had been a success so that I've been doing it now for a whole year and planning to continue on in through the year of 2023 doing that. But I distinctly remember going into Houston, basically when you move, it's a whole ordeal. But when I move once a month, it's a pretty quick and efficient process. I spend about 2 hours cleaning up, organizing my things, packing up, putting it in the back of my truck. Then I drive to the next place, which is not more than 3 hours away, and then unpack. And then I've moved. And when I first did it, I work remotely, so I worked during the day and then it hit 5 p.m. and it's like you step out the door, it's like, all right, I'm in Houston now. I have all these exciting, new, interesting things that I could check out. I have the opportunity to go to all these open mics and see how it goes and meet these people. So it was very exciting. And the very first day I was there, I went into open mics and discovered quickly that there's this energy behind the crowds in Houston. I appreciate it. So it's almost like I wasn't prepared for it, and that was when I realized that I got to think about what I say between my songs. So, for example, one of the open mics I did, I brought a Hinge date. It was a first date through online dating, and it's a pretty interesting first date to do it at an open mic, especially an open mic where people talk to each other. And, so you're not only having your date with somebody, but you're talking with those people, and the two of you are talking amongst a bunch of people. So it's a very dynamic and interesting first date scenario. And I would have to say it was the opposite of hinged. It was a bit unhinged. But at one point I remember, the crowd, they were so excited and energetic, and I was talking and she was like, "Play the next song, Buster." This is about that worry that you have when you drive a vehicle that has a lot of miles and you worry that it's going to break down every time you start it up.
That is relatable.
This one might get home there.
And it was kind of representative of that thing of I need to think about and prepare what I play between my songs. And generally, that first month I spent in Houston, I remember very frantically trying to book more gigs. Because when I moved to Texas, I had 1 gig on the calendar. And so I was just sitting at the table at the Airbnb after I got off of work, spending all this time trying to find places and contacting places. And gradually, I started to book up gigs on the calendar, at one point. And I had 10 gigs. And so it was very exciting and also very interesting and intimidating, because at one point I was booking and continuing to book a bunch of gigs without really having the experience of playing those gigs. And I thought, maybe I should pause. I should let some months go by, do these gigs, assess how it goes, because I don't want it to fail or I don't want to change my mind and then have a whole nother 6 months of gigs booked on the calendar that I would supposedly have to do. But instead of pausing, I just continued to carry forward and tried to book a bunch of gigs throughout. And I tried to get them at a variety of different places, from Mexican restaurants to regular restaurants, breweries, distilleries, wineries, coffee shops. So I tried not to be too picky at first, although now looking back on a year of experience, I know the things that I want to be picky about. So I'm grateful I had those early experiences of playing in places that for whatever reason now I don't want to play in those type of places, but I'm much better at, detecting them and distinguishing them so that I don't have to deal with that. So that's a great progress. Those are like part of the kinks to be ironed out. The other main point of kind of stress or concern was just staying in the Airbnbs this time and finding these places to stay. So that's another kink to work out, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But Houston is a very energetic city. Some people, they talk about how much they love Houston, and whenever they say that, I always get a little bit intrigued because I don't quite understand it. But what I think when people say that they love Houston, what I think they mean is that they love the people of Houston. And I think there's analogies between Houston and New York and Houston and Los Angeles. With New York, a lot of it is they like the people and they like the energy of the place. And that's what it is about Houston to me. This energy of drive and we're going to get things done. And it's a very intense energy. It's hard to deal with, I think, on a long-term basis. But staying there for a short term, picking up that energy boost and using it, and feeling it is a nice thing. And then, going away where it's not like that is just a breath of fresh air. And that's how it was going into the second month of the trip, going to stay in San Antonio, because San Antonio is a very laid back kind of, we'll do it tomorrow mentality. If you want to get things done, you don't necessarily expect that the world around you in San Antonio is going to be there to help you get it done right away. We'll get it done eventually, And it's almost like a representation of the slowness of San Antonio's music scene to recover from COVID. Because, I think that we don't fully appreciate the fact that even here at the end of 2022, there's still a lot of little micro scenes and a lot of people who've been impacted by it that you just don't see or you're not aware of. And the thing is, when you got a whole city, even if that city is 1 million people, that music scene, it could just be driven by 3 or 4 people in the scene. 3 or 4 people who know everybody, who book, who promote, and all those things, and play and bring everybody together. If a few of those people drop out during COVID, find a different job, just lose the habit or lose the hobby of it, then decide not to come back after things come back, then that scene has changed even years later. And so there are a lot of these pockets like that where they're still impacted just because of little things like that, key people who kind of dropped out and lost their influence around the area. So when I went to stay in San Antonio, I discovered I was driving up into this area of Texas frequently called the Hill Country area. And I found a very vibrant and interesting scene out there in the Hill Country. This includes cities like New Braunfels, San Marcos, Wimberley, Spring Branch. One of the things you could find in the Hill Country is Shade Tree Saloon, where David Lee hosts a songwriter circle. Got 3 songwriters up there sharing the stage with David Lee right in center. And he's written country songs with a bunch of famous artists that you've heard of. I won't rattle them off here, but just recognize that it's a pretty special thing to be out there and sharing songs at this place and to have this opportunity. Michael James is another one. He's played with a bunch of people you've heard of. He's written songs with people you've heard of. And he's out there jamming along, and you could jam with him and his really talented friends out there in the Hill Country too. Another component is the big place called Cheatham Street Warehouse, where it has a lot of history, where Kent Finley used to host and they still host it today by Missoula Slim. But this place was the origin for many people who got their start there, like George Strait, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Randy Rogers owns it right now. Tons of people were influenced by this place, and what they learned is, Kent Finley has the songwriters circle there, and he would stand at the same spot of the bar every time and listen to the songwriters. And so he created a place where people would listen, and that meant that the performers would try and develop their act based on an audience that paid attention. They were motivated to do that. So it shapes the way they think, it shapes what they do on stage, and it motivates them to build up a craft and build up stories in ways that they talk about their songs that engages the audience. And that, I learned, is a uniquely Texan thing, really. And it's really unique to the Hill Country area, I would say. The fact that they focus on this craft of telling stories between songs, setting up their songs with prepared things that they say. And it's striking how much you see it in the Hill Country area when you see artists playing. But it's also striking when you see people from outside the area who don't do that. It's very noticeable. They simply don't appreciate it as much, and you can tell. So at Cheatham Street, that's where the culture of that really kind of originated. And one of the kind of key examples for me is Todd Snyder, because he was mentored there too. And he's clearly a great example of somebody who learns the craft of stage presence and crowd work and storytelling between songs. So I found that kind of epicenter, and of course it interested me a lot to see it, but it also actually gave me the energy to do that myself. And I didn't quite realize it until the next visit when I stayed in New Braunfels, and then the next time again when I stayed in New Braunfels. So it's been a gradual process of thinking about that, slowly bringing it into my gigs, and slowly thinking about the different stories that I might want to tell. But I have to mention the Redbird listening room there, which I also discovered at that time, my first trip into the Hill Country area, where Dallas Burrow, who is also inspired by Kent Finley and Cheatham Street Warehouse, hosts his own songwriter night there, where you have that attentive crowd and you have that environment that can motivate you to work on the stories you tell and work on your own original songs. So that's the Hill Country. Spent a month there. Now go up to Austin for a month. Like the previous stays, I went and checked out a bunch of open mics in Austin to figure out the music scene, and also as an excuse to just go check out different places and drive around and make sure I understood the area as much as possible. Now, at the end of my trip in Austin, that's when I discovered the country dancing scene. I found Little Longhorn Saloon and met people, and they told me where to go. And then I found Sagebrush the very last night that I stayed in Austin. And I loved this place. And I saw people who were dancing, who knew how to dance, who I could dance with and have a great time. So I, at this point, was like, all right, I'm feeling good about coming back into Austin 3 months from now and really uncovering this dancing scene. But there are some challenges in Austin. It's almost a city that it feels like it's not going to be there for you when you need that city to be there for you. So in some sense, you think of like that Hollywood where you have a piece of wood of a building that's just propped up and then a gust of wind comes over and knocks it over. Austin feels a little bit like that for me. Feels a little bit like a facade. But just to give an example of the kind of facade feeling that I was getting there in Austin, when first day I stayed in that Airbnb, took a shower and I went to pull the towel from the shower, and I went to pull the towel from the towel rack, and the towel rack just fell right out of the wall. And at first I was like, oh my gosh, I pulled on it too hard. But then I started to realize, like, no, I've been doing this for a long time throughout my life, and I've never really had this problem. And so it's probably the towel rack's fault. And so basically I discovered that I'm a part of a series of people who stay at this Airbnb, and on the very first night they stay there, they pull the towel out of the wall because it's not fixed in very well. And then the last night that they stay, they just shove it back in. So that's like one of the examples there. I also remember from this Airbnb, these giant cockroaches that would be inside. It happened about once a week or twice a week. And that's the thing about Austin is supposedly it's like the cockroach capital of the US or of Texas or something. But they do have them there because it's such a nature, kind of place. And they can come in, apparently. I've seen them, and it really sucks. They're really big. One of them, when I finished taking a shower, I pulled a piece of clothing off of the counter, and I hear this thud on the ground. And I frantically am looking for my glasses, and I find them, and it's a cockroach. So they're big enough that you can hear when they jump from the counter onto the ground, the little sound of all their little feet hitting the floor at the same time. You can actually hear that. So I went in from Austin, staying up into Dallas for a month, and the difference was striking in terms of how nice it is, in terms of how you could stay in Dallas. I stayed in this, I guess it could be thought of as like a condo or something, but it was big, it was nice, and cheaper than Austin. So that's one of the big kind of discrepancies that I notice every time I transition from Austin up into the DFW area. But I went into Dallas, and like I did in all the other places, I went to try to check out as many open mics as I possibly could to figure out the scene as quick as possible. And, you do notice how fancy things are in Dallas, and the people are too. You could think of like the women of Dallas. They're dressed nice, they work in real estate, they've got blonde hair, high heels, and big boobs. Think about Austin. One of the things I would say about people in Austin is you tend to meet people who work in sales who don't like their jobs. So one of the kind of universal things about Austin is that people who have jobs, like if they're in tech or wherever they are working, they have a side hobby that's artistic. And that's why they're in Austin, because there is that big art scene, which includes music, of course. And so you find that they have that passion of playing violin or playing the keyboard or whatever it is. I used to meet people, used to say the stereotype in Austin is you meet people who work in sales who hate their job. And I figure that's because those are the ones who are still there. I was talking to somebody, he said, I haven't seen a hippie in Austin in 10 years. It was, as if the hippies are extinct there, which really struck me because you see people that look like hippies, but they're not the hippie that he's talking about. There's a different quality of hippie that used to be in Austin. And now the kind of stereotype I think of is like, with the women, you'll see some skinny women with not wearing any bras, maybe with some armpit hair. That's something you'll see in Austin. So going around Dallas, stayed there for a month, and then I made it back into Houston again for a month. And the difference between Dallas and Houston at this point was really striking. Well, I came into Houston, and the very first stop that I stopped at was a jam session at this place. I think it was called County Line Bar and Grill. And you just look around and see the difference immediately. The people are wearing jeans and regular t-shirts with print on them. They're acting more unassuming, less sophisticated, more down to earth. That's like the Houston vibe. Very much a working city where people want to get their work done. And what was really striking to me is somebody came in and they offered a free bunch of crawfish. And that seemed like a very unique and Houston sort of thing. And it reminded me that Houston is actually a part of the South. So when I think of the South, I actually think of it spreading into Texas, into the Houston area. Particularly, one of the places where you'll see it is just walking around and looking at the sidewalks, which was always a distinct thing in the South for me, that the sidewalks aren't this light-colored gray. They have this more variable shades of gray, including darker gray, and they tend to crack more for whatever reason. So you'll see those distinct-looking sidewalks in the South, to me. And then there's the vegetation, the trees, and so on of that area, which also is reminiscent of the South. And the idea of giving away free crawfish right there at the bar is a very Southern thing. I know when I was living in Birmingham, Alabama, it's like every Saturday you could go to the pub and the football game would be on, and they would just have free food there at the pub that you could eat. And just to talk about the down-to-earth nature of Houston, this was just something that I thought was so fascinating. I was hanging out at this coffee shop, and all these tables surrounding me, all these kind of students just working. But this kind of fancy corporate people come in, dressed nice. This is like lunchtime out of their 9-to-5 job. And they come in and then they leave. And once they leave, everybody who's surrounding me at the tables, they're all talking amongst each other. They're like, did you notice how her assistant got the coffee for her and prepared the coffee for her? So everybody there was just so fascinated by the fact that there was this fancy person who had an assistant, and the assistant was doing kind of menial tasks for them, like getting and preparing their coffee. They were so fascinated at the absurdity of this. And that really represents like how Houston is down to earth and kind of the opposite of Dallas in that regard. So anyway, when I came into Houston that second month, one of the first stops I wanted to make was JP Hop's house, because I had discovered the first time I visited, I played the open mic there, and then Pam, the owner, immediately came up to me and she's like, I want to put you on the calendar. Let's get you to play this month. So I got a gig there on a Wednesday just by popping in for the open mic. So I figured I'll pop in for the open mic again, talk to Pam and see if she could get me another gig there. And so that happened, that worked out. And I remember I played that second gig there at JP Hop's house, and it wasn't to very many people, but I remember just playing my original songs there for a short, 40-minute set, and then going and hanging out with the folks who were there and just being like, this is great. It's an amazing thing to be doing, to just be going into a city, to get into a place where you could publicly play for 40 minutes to a little crowd and then go and hang out with the crowd and talk to the crowd. That's what this is about, really, at the end of the day. At this point, I had probably played about a dozen gigs or so across Texas, and I was sorting out the kinks in some ways, Some of the gigs went well. Some of them were just mediocre in terms of the feeling and the crowd and so on. And at some point, I had reached this kind of tipping point. I think this was around the point where I reached about 20 gigs, where I felt like I wasn't engaging with the crowd very much. And I was just like, you need to start talking to the crowd more. You have to start doing that. Because one of the things I didn't really mention I just play original songs during my shows. And especially like in the Houston area, when I tell people that, they get really surprised and it's like, oh my gosh. It seems like a big barrier. Certainly it limits the amount of tips that I get, and it limits the amount of gigs that I can get. But playing covers allows you to connect with the crowd more because they recognize the covers. But the other thing that lets you connect with the crowd is talking to the crowd. And so I realized I had to start talking to the crowd more. And and a big component of that was going back into New Braunfels outside of Houston. Every Thursday I'd go to the Redbird listening room, but I would prepare and think about which songs I was going to play and think about, in particular, the stories I wanted to tell for those songs. So I played a gig in Conroe recently to 4 people. Sometimes those things can happen in Conroe.
If it's the right 4 people, yeah.
Yeah, 2 bartenders too, so 6 people. And 2 of them were my friends, so shout out to my friends for coming out. Another 2 were on their second date, but the guy seemed more interested in the bartender than he did his date.
Wow.
But during my break, the bartender, she lives there in Conroe, I was talking to her and she was like, oh, I love Houston, I love Dallas, I love Austin. I was like, I never hear people say that. Usually people love the town that they live, and they have a reason why they don't need to be in the towns that they can't spend a lot of time in. And I was just thinking about that, and then I realized, it's because she lives in Conroe. She lives anywhere else that's not Conroe. So New Braunfels is the place where I do that. And it's a place where I get encouraged to do that and where they have an environment to do that. And just like they've been doing that for decades. there in that area to build up all these artists who have really perfected the crowd work and the craft of what they do. So that's a special place when I stay there, that I know that I try to soak in and absorb that and appreciate that. And then I hope that when I build that up there in the New Braunfels area, that it translates and maintains with me when I go up to Austin and DFW and back to Houston. But often that energy kind of dissolves if you don't get surrounded by audiences that pay attention very much. Then it starts to go away. That energy starts to go away in the motivation. But I started to try to bring this mentality into my gigs. It's a slow and gradual process. And I'll talk about that even more as we go back into the third time coming around in the New Braunfels. So then I go back into Austin for that second month. And now I know how to get into that country dancing scene there. So I really focused in on understanding that country dancing scene, and also experienced the difficulties of living in Austin yet again. I stayed at an Airbnb. Again, they're always pretty small places that you're staying. But for the entire month, the garbage disposal in the sink didn't work. And they just never fixed it. I bothered them about it. They didn't fix it. And this is part of the ironing out the kinks of this whole process, is understanding and identifying good places to stay versus places that aren't as good to stay. And that's where I got more sensitive to the notion of these corporate Airbnbs. So what I call a corporate Airbnb is one that generally is like an apartment within an apartment complex, and that unit is an Airbnb, but often many other units in that apartment complex are also Airbnbs. So it's kind of owned and run by a corporate entity, and there's a person that answers the messages, and that's their job, that's their role. But their job inherently sucks. It's not a glorious job to be doing that. You might think, oh, I'm helping people be tourists and explore the city. I'm like a travel agent. I'm like a concierge. That's not how it is. You're a landlord, basically. These people don't like their job. They don't care if they fail at their job. Because it's corporate, there's a diffusion of responsibility. When it's a single person who runs the Airbnb, all the responsibility falls on that person, and they're motivated to do a good job. When it's a corporate entity with some person who's working with a bunch of other people, the blame and the accountability spreads throughout the organization. This person doesn't care. So I remember I left a load of laundry in Austin that second month that I stayed there, and I drove up to Dallas and discovered that I had left that load of laundry. So I messaged the Airbnb person, like, hey, it sucks. I left a load of laundry. I don't know if there's anything I could do. But I never heard back from them. So if there's anybody in Austin who's got a blow up your TV t-shirt, then that's my shirt. You've got my clothes. I left a load of laundry in Austin, heading on down to Dallas. And that was a bit of a memorable time for me, because the same time I discovered, first of all, I was in Austin, and so I got chewed up and spit out by the dating scene of Austin. It's a bit brutal, the dating scene. For one, you'll meet these women who are in relationships who are like, oh yeah, like they downplay their relationship as if they're interested in you. And so that's going on. That's called branch swinging. Is like people who are in a relationship or dating someone, but they're fully happy to date somebody else if they like that other person more. People are very conscientious about how connected you are in the scene of Austin. So I got a good story here. I overheard this at a coffee shop. Some guy who lived in Austin was dating a woman, but she didn't live in Austin. So she comes to visit him and gets into his friends group, and she's just having an amazing time with him and his whole social network. She says to him, I want to move to Austin. And he says, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think we would be able to date any longer. And she doesn't care. She moves to Austin anyway, and she continues to be involved in that friend group and that social network. So you imagine just there's these young people who are trying to carve their way in life. They find this place where there's tons of energy and there's this vibrant social scene, and they can connect and just have this experience. And even if it means doing something like that, they're willing to do it because they're so thriving and engaged by that experience. And I think that if you've heard about dating in New York City, I imagine there's some analogies there, because in New York, everybody's kind of transient. So they don't approach dating with any kind of sort of long-term thinking. They always imagine that something else is going to come up that disrupts and comes in the way. So I think that's how Austin works. But I'm leaving Austin that third month, coming up into Dallas, left my load of laundry there. And shortly into the stay in Dallas, my catalytic converter was stolen. So I got slowed down a little bit, just, a few days getting that repaired. But it was more just having that pop up into my mind. So for one, I talked a little bit about the challenges of living as a digital nomad in Texas. You have to establish a residency with using an address that doesn't have a physical property on it, and get your license and so on that way. But you also have to have an insurance company that will insure you. And that's one of the initial challenges that I got, was that I called State Farm and I was like, yeah, here's my address, but I'm not going to actually be at that address ever. And these insurance companies just can't handle that information. They can't comprehend the fact that your car might not always be at the address that you have listed for your insurance. But, we're living in the year 2022 here. And so I got rid of that insurance company, and I found one that has worked with me so far. But that incident of getting my catalytic converter stolen was a test of my insurance to see if it worked and if they brought up any issues of, this happened here, your address says you live here, and so on. But I also distinctly remember when I went to the auto repair place and I, got the keys back and drove off after paying the bill. She said to me, I hope you go at least another month without your catalytic converter getting stolen again. So now it's just this idea that I'm carrying around this $400 piece that could be stolen off my car, that they can use to get $400 with. How many times is this going to be happening for me? That was a reality I was faced with in that time. But overall, when I came into Dallas for that second month, I went out to a lot of live music and tried to experience it. But what was really striking to me is that the people in the crowd just weren't as engaged with live music as I'd experienced in other places. And so Dallas really seemed to be a little bit limited or kind of unmotivating to me, because, I don't know, it's just not very fun when you're in the audience and the other audience members aren't having a great time and being super into it. Although at the same time on this trip, that's when I discovered the Stephenville and Granbury area. So if you take a look at the gigs I played, there's a whole pocket of gigs I played out in this area, and these gigs went pretty well for me. So this area really caught my eye, got my attention, and that combined with things of Dallas made me think, next time I'm going to stay in Fort Worth when I come up to this area. I'll be closer to that Granbury, Stephenville area where I had some gigs, and try it out. So then after that month in Dallas, I'm going back to Houston again for another month. And this is where I had a kind of transformative experience. Remember, I was talking about Dallas Burrow and how he hosts a open mic, or he hosts a songwriter night at the Redbird Listening Room in New Braunfels. Well, he played a gig at Dozy Do's in Houston area. So I went to see his gig and just, watched the way he played his songs and the stories that he told between his songs. And what I noticed, basically, what really hit me is the way that he weaved one song into the next as a kind of progression throughout his life. So it's like, here I'm in this phase of my life, this is what's happening, and now this phase comes, and now this phase. So every song was part of a sequence of this part of growth and these part of changes. And that really kind of transformed my thinking. And I had a gig the very next day. And so I took that mentality into my gig. It was like, I'm going to start off with this sequence of songs that talks about these things. Maybe these songs have a traveling theme. And so I'm talking about going around the panhandle of Florida here. And then I'm talking about going around Mississippi here. And then I'm talking about driving in Illinois. And so I see the themes across my songs and how those themes can connect into weaving a story throughout the whole thing. And then that's the thing that I appreciate. And like I was mentioning, this is a skill I try to develop in New Braunfels, where I have that time to take the foot off the accelerator and think about these things and think about the underlying themes that connect collections of songs. They're about travel. They're about the weather. They're about your relationship to time and thinking about the time in the past, present, and future. I've got a whole collection of songs about family. I've got songs about love, songs about relationships. And so you can think about these themes. What are the interesting themes? What are the interesting things that surround these themes? How can I tell them, and how can I weave that all together? So that was a transformative thing, just to see Dallasboro do that, just to watch these people and how they do their craft and be inspired by it. And as I get more experience gigging, I get more experience and practice trying to do that. And so I approach gigs with that way. I approach gigs with the mentality of, I'm going to try to weave in these stories and talk to the crowd between songs. And, maybe it'll last 40 minutes until I start to get fatigued. And then I just kind of play and scale back from that. Or it could last an hour and 20 minutes if things are going really well. But obviously I want to keep building up that ability so that it can last longer. Often we've got to play these 3-hour gigs, and 3 hours is simply a long time to try to really maintain that engagement and talkative nature with the crowd. But, I want to keep building this up and practicing it. So I kept practicing it. I stayed for Houston for that third month. I came into New Braunfels to stay there for the second time. And then I came into Austin for that third month in Austin. And this third trip to Austin was shaping up to be pretty wild. I came into, my favorite place at the time was Sagebrush. That first night I came in, I was drinking and dancing, and the band was so great and talking to people. And all of a sudden I was given a bunch of these hemp blunts, which have legal THC in them. So they do have psychoactive properties. So I was dancing around with these hemp blunts in my back pocket, just thinking, man, this is going to be a wild and great month in Austin. And it was, I was having a good time, staying out till midnight a lot of times and going back home and having these hemp blunts out on that porch swing there. I was staying at an RV there in Austin, which was quite unusual and interesting. But this whole collection of things, I pushed myself too far. And about 2 weeks in, I got sick. I got really knocked out by this cold or flu or whatever it was, and had to cancel a gig because of it. Got knocked out for 2 weeks, and ultimately made it up into Fort Worth for the last month of the trip. And the thing about Fort Worth is there's a lot going on here. It's an exciting place so far. I forgot to mention, when I first moved to Texas, there, at this bar, I just happened to meet two country performers, and I got to talk to them a little bit. And, one of them pointed out the New Braunfels area and how exciting and interesting it was. But he told me it'll take you a long time to figure out the music scene of New Braunfels. It could take you at least 6 months to figure out to the point where you can recognize the names of the people who are playing and kind of know who they are and recognize all the places where people are playing. Because there's simply so many. Often there will be a list of places with live music in New Braunfels area, and amongst that whole area, there could be like 40 different places having live music. And so when I came up into Fort Worth, I basically discovered that whole thing, this whole scene of music that I had no knowledge of, that I still needed to discover, even after the end of a whole year of doing this. And so basically that's kind of the theme. I I went around, I played 47 gigs, I experienced all these areas. I got immersed in the Texas music scene. I went to the most amazing places that you could go. Pick any of the top places to catch live music in Texas, and I've probably been there, from Green Hall to Billy Bob's to Devil's Backbone to Broken Spoke, the White Horse, Mucky Duck, Anderson Fair, Old Quarter Acoustic Cafe. So many of these places that I've been to and experienced. But at the same time, I have to keep in mind that really I've just scratched the surface. There's so much here, so much to try to understand. And I look forward to trying to explore more into the next year of 2023 and sharing my experiences so that you can understand it too, if it's useful or valuable or entertaining at all for you. So thanks for checking out this video. Now, I do post a bunch of videos about the Texas music scene, like I mentioned. I've got playlists where I just talk about the venues across these areas. And I've got playlists where I talk about the individual cities, what they look like, and where live music is in those cities across these different areas. Let me know in the comments what else I should check out, and thank you for your support.